Philosophers talk to our times, we the citizens of dystopia. One of the curious things in dystopia is watching how the historical double death of the soul is played out in real time, in politics. You see, the idea of personal identity was destroyed twice in philosophy, in a very different way, in a very different rhythm, with very different results. Once was famously right at the beginning of the Enlightenment by David Hume, a philosopher I have so much time for. David Hume accidentally almost unpicked the notion of the mind that had been the holding function of empiricism since Berkeley, and revealed it as an empty idea, devoid of anything but a bundle of concepts endlessly shifting and changing. He then thinks, oh gosh, what do I do now? And goes off and plays backgammon, laughs at philosophy, and tries to rethink it. And then there is Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's very nuanced, careful deconstruction of any notion of personal identity. There is no point getting rid of God, he would say, if you scream and say, well, I must keep my soul. I must keep the idea of identity in the world. Identity then becomes lost within the dancing of the will to power, as differentials lock one with the other, and we get across our lives the right to be Odysseus, to take 20 years if we want, to do a journey that should have taken 2 weeks, to pitch up on islands, have experiences, manage to kill all our crew, and learn nothing in the result. But that is what life looks like. An endless sequence of shifts and of moves. One doesn't then mourn the loss of identity or ignore it like David Hume. One rather revels in it. One pitches up at their identity as Odysseus pitched up in an island for a while before one moves on. These two great theories have very different rhythms because they created different philosophies that kind of spun off them. And the way they're used by different political parties is different. And actually watching out them conflict in real time is one of the privileges of a philosopher in dystopia. On the one hand, then, you have the postmodern tradition that hollows out the Nietzsche's perspective and understands how notions of identity are soaked with notions of power. This is all Foucault, and the soul is the prison for the body. In my theory of identity, I try to nail myself down, stop myself oozing across a life, make myself this man, this woman. And so there is always a tension between that scream that demands you to be this creature and actually what happens. How you can just dance in the dying embers of God and enjoy for a while being this person or that. How I can, over the course of a life, be a maths teacher, a philosopher, a tree surgeon, a teacher, I've done teacher, storyteller, DJ, etc., etc., etc. But remained a toodle underneath. And yet, to be caught in the postmodern prism requires a mixture of two things. First of all, it requires a real impetus. The drive of society, the existing power structures of society, tries to hold you down to identities. It tries to force you in. Of course it does. It makes life terribly easy for a state if everybody behaves themselves, is definable. One of the things that's, of course, that's going on with AI is a new way to think about defining humans. Putting them down little blind alleys of algorithms. That means that it might ooze out of who they were, out of any one theory of identity, out of a simple soul, but you'll catch them in a new sort of soul. So you need some desperation, some reason to pitch up and move. And secondly, and importantly, you need considerable resources, plausibly financial, certainly mental, a certain degree of self-confidence, an ability to allow yourself to reform who you are repeatedly. And so you will get postmodern theories invariably in any great struggle, any great challenge of authority, which seeks to unpick the very notion of identity. And there will always therefore be an affinity between these struggles. I have expressed elsewhere that I personally have a slight reservation here. Not that in making one particular struggle, a group of people doesn't challenge the very notion of identity. And not that it isn't necessary. But merely that whether they'll end up as just Odysseus that goes to one island and settles down, or actually just pitch themselves off into the wider sea. I'm ambivalent about intersectionality. My experience of it is that people who believe in one cause and unpick one lot of identities don't want to move to unpick another lot of identities. Look at the fate of radical feminism in Britain. Split on the issue of trans. It's a classic example. The very notion of turf breaks my heart, but I wish that it was not true. So, in order to keep the identity charabang going, keeping Odysseus upon the Aegean, on the wine dark sea, you have to have some sort of wider mental capital, a contentment to unpick who you are and allow yourself to be unpicked again, not just a need to run from hither to thither. It is quite a difficult trick. It requires, as I said, constant desperation, but also a constant ability, a mental capacity to always be content to rethrow yourself. And a realization that some of those throws you make will be wrong, won't work for you. And an ability to cope with that. It's why traditionally it was caught up with the university classes. It was one of the things that degrees teach you, is the ability to rethink who you are. It's one of the options that being a student gives you, is to rethrow your identity for a while, for 3 years, for a bit. What about the other great theory of identity, other great theory that deconstructed identity? Let's go back to David Hume and his gammon throwing. Of course, backgammon, sorry. He doesn't, of course, leave it playing gammon. He goes back to philosophy. And he invents, for me, one of the unsung but greatest theories of identity in the face of the impossibility of the idea of the mind. He invents an idea by which you can create through your property, through properties that you have, a feeling of your self-identity. And it's from this feeling he will unpick an entire theory of morality. So very famous, and I've talked about it before on this channel, he will say you need to create a four-way thought between yourself, something you are proud of that gives you pleasure, and yourself, and something you're proud of that gives you pleasure. The classic example he uses is, of course, a house. And as you think about your house, remember this is the great age of the 18th century. Humans really were defined by their houses, by the improvements they made, the fountains they built. I mean, in David Hume's class they were. You would go to some, Elizabeth Darcy goes to Elizabeth judges Darcy on the quality of his house after all. You could see into somebody's humanity through the way they treated their staff and the kind of house that they built. And that is very much David Hume's theory. And then as you think of your house, you'll think of yourself, and you'll feel a pride in yourself for owning this house. And your idea of yourself living in the house gains an attraction in your mind. You feel its truth, because the ideas all enforce each other. The joy of the house, the pride in yourself, the idea of the house and the idea of you in it. And so you can create a theory of identity linked to a theory of property. As I said, it's an idea I find endlessly enticing, because it's very far from most theories of identity that I know, and yet it's bizarrely true. Having been homeless for a while and lived in a van, it is difficult to actually sometimes hold your identity down. You end up drinking, to be honest with you, because your identity starts to wibble and to wobble. David Hume is not totally wrong here. But of course, if you don't have a house, what then? Well, there is no particular reason in the David Humean model that you couldn't pitch up your theory of identity in almost anything. Race, for instance. Nationality, for instance. A pride in your gender, for instance. You think of masculinity, you feel proud, you feel yourself to be masculine, you know you are real. Likewise, you know you are an Englishman. You feel pride in that understanding of English history that you have. You feel yourself to be part of that history. You feel joy in yourself. You become what you are. That little quadruped has become the rival theory of how you cope with the deconstruction of identity. Perhaps you could just pitch up identity by pulling out one of those standard identities, the kind that postmodernism endlessly deconstructs, and just feel it regardless. And of course, postmodernism, as it allows you to pitch up an identity, be it for a while and move on, can't stop you. Nobody will stop you doing it. But the mechanics of doing it are different. The mechanics of doing it are different because this time it's now much more of a desperate move. Because this group of people are those who do feel themselves disempowered by postmodernism. Not by its actuality. The idea that the white in Europe are disadvantaged is just poppycock. I mean, it's not worth farting at as an idea. It's so ludicrous. That's practically. That's on the world of materiality. The world, remember that this is how their identity is going to be created anyway. But intellectually, they're done. Intellectually, one of the things that postmodernism certainly does is to cook their goose, because it undermines all the levers, the mechanics, the drives by which they thought their power was necessary. God-given. Part of the soul of the world, caught up in Geist. All that goes. And so, intellectually, yes, they are totally, apparently bankrupt, even though in terms of power, of course, they're not. But David Hume gives them a way to hold on to that power, to rejoice in it. They attach it to whatever idea they like, be it a threadbare masculinity that wants to have wrestling on your birthday. Oh, God. Or waging endless war and demands men look like action men of their youth, the G.I. Joes they played with when they were a boy and fantasized about. Or part of St. George and the Crusades. All these cod identities are caught up then in this quadruped that is working differently from postmodernism. In postmodernism, you revel in the identity, but you know it is transitory. It moves, it shifts, it changes. The point about a Humean identity is that it is a great big edifice of a thing. It will never move. The pride and joy you feel in your house and the joy that is yourself are one and the same joy. But there are other differences that are rather interesting too. The postmodern movement is always caught up with Foucault's lauding, I suppose is my best word, promoting ethics over morality. So a postmodern view, Odysseus ought to be ethical, even if he isn't moral. He doesn't lecture others, he thinks about what will help himself and talks to others about what will help themselves. The Humean theory is, of course, endlessly moral, because once you've got personal identity rooted to individual materiality, it becomes necessary to defend that materiality and to lecture others about why you should have what you have, because it all becomes part of how you unpick your personal identity. And so your own local practice becomes what everybody ought to be doing. And you're forever generalizing for everybody else. And so you get different movements within ethics and morality. One side will hector the other, saying you must do this, you should do this, we all ought to be Englishmen in this land. While the other, the postmodernism, couldn't give two fucks. It's all about just how they are, how they move themselves and change what they can be. And it's interesting because these two theories, as I say, play out in real time in our dystopia. They effectively make any conversation between elements within it impossible. Literally impossible. How can they talk to each other? Because the very way they're understanding identity, although it is both rooted in a deconstruction of actual truth, is totally, totally distinct. It also explains why charlatans and liars do so very well in that model that has become the right wing. Because the right, of course, has changed. 40 years ago, it didn't do this. This is the new model for the right. This pitching up in Hume. I think he would hate it terribly. But never mind. It doesn't matter about truth. Of course it doesn't matter about truth. The thing was never about truth anyway. Pointing out endlessly that Farage and Le Pen and Trump lie is of no consequence whatsoever. Why does that matter? Because truth was all perception anyway. What matters is the myth of identity, the ability to set up myths that allow people to rivet themselves down, to become this person linked to this property at this time, and feel that it is somehow eternal. It really is a cult, because this is the stuff of religion. Hume would know that. The point is, although he doesn't do it because he is trying to find a new ethic for the 18th century, religion traditionally did this. It rooted people down, rooted people's identity down to make them feel who they felt themselves to be. And that is what these cults are doing. And on the other side, us postmodern Odysseus's, well, Odysseus was a prat. You're always better off being Penelope. Just saying it. I always tell the story from Penelope's point of view. It's much, much more exciting. But that's a total beside the point. Us modern Odysseus's wandering vaguely around the Aegean. We know that truth doesn't really exist anyway, but we get terribly het up when the other side starts telling obvious lies because it just feels naff. Or at least it does to me. It feels like you don't really understand why it is you don't have a personal identity, which of course they don't. And that means you accept things that are clear and obvious lies. You believe the words of cyclopses and listen to the songs of sirens. But how you solve such a conflict of very different deconstructions of what it is to not be at all is, I think, going to be one of those great mysteries of our time. Because it doesn't strike me that there's an easy way to pull apart the human identity. It does work. Hume is always right. He is right that this is a way in which we can rethrow identity. So moving that, a way of understanding who and what you are, to one that is more compatible with the humanity's continued existence on the planet, or, as I would say, with the actual realities of power. It's going to be one of those very complicated moves that we've either got to achieve or we're fated to remain in dystopia.